The sun dipped low over the horizon, painting the coastal town in hues of gold and amber. Families strolled along the boardwalk, their laughter mingling with the sound of crashing waves. It was a picture-perfect scene, but beneath the surface, an undercurrent of tension simmered. Shopkeepers exchanged wary glances as outsiders passed by, and whispers rippled through groups of locals whenever someone unfamiliar lingered too long. Marcus wandered the boardwalk, his camera slung around his neck like a lifeline. He paused to capture moments that others might overlook: a child chasing seagulls, an elderly couple holding hands on a bench. Each click of the shutter filled him with purpose. Photography wasn't just a hobby, it was how he made sense of the world, how he found beauty even when life felt heavy. But today, something felt different. Eyes followed him wherever he went, curious, skeptical, judgmental. For the first time on this vacation, Marcus became acutely aware of how out of place he seemed here. A black teenager in a town where most faces were white. He tried to shake off the feeling, focusing instead on framing the perfect shot near the pier. A group of tourists laughed nearby, their joy infectious. As he adjusted his lens, a shadow fell across his viewfinder. Officer Lawson stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "What are you doing?" the officer asked, his tone clipped. Marcus lowered the camera, startled. "Just taking pictures," he said, forcing a smile. "It's kind of my thing." "Your thing?" Officer Lawson repeated, stepping closer. His eyes flicked to the camera, then back to Marcus. "You know, people don't usually bring cameras to places like this unless they're up to something." "I'm not up to anything," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. "I'm here on vacation with my family. I like photography. It's what I want to do someday." Officer Lawson didn't seem convinced. "Where'd you get the camera?" "It was a gift," Marcus explained, gripping the strap tightly. "Look, I'm not bothering anyone. I'm just trying to take some photos." But the officer wasn't listening anymore. His suspicion had hardened into certainty. "Turn around," he ordered abruptly. "What? Why?" Marcus's heart raced. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Turn around now," Officer Lawson barked, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. The metal clicked shut around Marcus's wrists before he could protest further. Tourists stopped to stare, their smiles fading into confusion and discomfort. Marcus stood frozen, humiliation washing over him in waves. How could this be happening? All he'd wanted was to capture a moment of beauty, and now he was being treated like a criminal. Back at the hotel, Marcus's parents paced anxiously, phones pressed to their ears. "What do you mean, arrested?" his mother demanded, her voice trembling. "For what? He's 16 years old." His father clenched his fists, frustration etched into every line of his face. "We need to get him out of there. This can't be real." Meanwhile, at the station, Officer Lawson sat at his desk, staring at the booking form. The name Marcus Johnson stared back at him, familiar yet jarring. Steve Harvey's nephew? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Suddenly, this wasn't just another routine arrest. It was a potential PR nightmare. He rubbed his temples, guilt gnawing at him. Had he jumped to conclusions too quickly, or was he simply doing his job? Outside the station, a crowd began to gather. Protest signs bobbed in the air. Justice for Marcus. End racial profiling. News of the arrest had gone viral after a bystander posted footage online. Social media erupted with outrage, hashtags trending nationwide. Commenters condemned the injustice, sharing their own stories of racial bias. The pressure mounted, both inside and outside the station. In the holding cell, Marcus sat alone, replaying the events in his mind. Why had the officer assumed the worst about him? Was it because of his skin color? His age? The camera? He thought about all the times he'd been followed in stores or ignored by teachers who didn't believe in his potential. Those memories weighed heavily on him now, making the cuffs around his wrists feel tighter than ever. At home, Marcus's aunt called, her voice urgent. "Steve wants to help," she said. "He's ready to make a statement if you think it'll help." Marcus hesitated. Part of him wanted to say yes, to let his famous uncle use his platform to demand justice. But another part of him worried it would overshadow the bigger issue. "Tell him thanks," he finally replied. "But I don't want this to just be about me. It's about everyone who's been treated like they don't belong." By morning, the story had reached national news outlets. Reporters camped outside the station, microphones at the ready. Inside, officers scrambled to contain the fallout. Some argued for releasing Marcus quietly, while others pushed for damage control. Amid the chaos, one thing was clear. This incident had sparked a conversation that couldn't be ignored. When Marcus was finally released, he stepped outside to find supporters waiting for him. Strangers held signs bearing messages of solidarity, their cheers lifting his spirits. For the first time since the arrest, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this wasn't just a story of injustice. It could also be a story of change. The cold, sterile air of the police station pressed down on Marcus as he sat alone in a small holding cell. The silence was deafening, amplifying every thought racing through his mind. He hugged his knees to his chest, trying to make himself smaller, as if that could somehow shield him from the weight of what had just happened. Every second felt like an eternity, dragging him deeper into a pit of anger and humiliation. He replayed the arrest over and over again, each detail sharper and more painful than before. The officer's accusing tone, the way people stared at him as though he were dangerous, the sound of handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists. "What did I do wrong?" Marcus whispered to himself, his voice trembling. "I wasn't hurting anyone, I was just taking pictures?" But no matter how many times he asked the question, the answer remained elusive. Maybe it wasn't about what he'd done. Maybe it was about who he was. Memories surfaced unbidden, flooding his mind with moments when he first realized the world treated him differently. He remembered being 8 years old, trailing behind his mom in a department store, only to notice the security guard following them, aisle after aisle. He thought back to middle school, where teachers praised his white classmates for their potential, but dismissed him as someone who might not go far. And then there was the time he'd been stopped by another officer while walking home from basketball practice, simply because his hoodie made him look suspicious. Each memory stung, deepening the ache inside him. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. At the front desk, officers spoke in hushed tones, their indifference cutting like a knife. "Kid's probably lying," one muttered, barely glancing at the paperwork. "You know how these types are." Another shrugged. If he didn't want trouble, he shouldn't have been carrying that camera around. Their words hung heavy in the air, confirming what Marcus already knew. They saw him not as a person, but as a stereotype, a threat before he even opened his mouth. Meanwhile, outside the station, Marcus's parents scrambled to navigate the labyrinth of legal procedures. His mother clutched her phone, frantically calling lawyers while his father filled out forms, his hands shaking with frustration. "Why is this so hard?" his dad snapped, slamming a pen onto the counter. "We're just trying to bring our son home." A clerk glanced up briefly, then returned to her work without a word. The system wasn't designed to help families like theirs. It was built to wear them down. Back in the station, Officer Lawson stared at the booking form, his stomach churning. Marcus Johnson? The name nagged at him, tugging loose threads in his mind until realization dawned. Steve Harvey's nephew? Panic bubbled beneath the surface. What had he done? Had he really arrested the relative of a national celebrity? For a moment, doubt crept in. Was Marcus guilty, or had Lawson let his biases cloud his judgment? Word spread quickly among the officers. Some whispered nervously about public backlash, while others suggested using the celebrity connection to shift blame elsewhere. "This isn't our fault," one argued. "The kid shouldn't have been wandering around with that camera." But Lawson couldn't shake the unease settling in his chest. He thought about his own teenage son, about how he'd feel if someone treated him this way. Guilt gnawed at him, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and the system he served. In his cell, Marcus wrestled with self-doubt. Maybe photography wasn't worth it anymore. Maybe it was too risky to stand out, to chase something that made him different. He imagined blending in instead, keeping his head down, staying invisible. Wouldn't that be easier? Safer? But then he heard her voice, soft yet firm, echoing in his memory, his grandmother. She'd always told him, "Don't let them dim your light, Marcus. Your gifts are meant to shine even when the world tries to hide them." Her words sparked something inside him, a flicker of defiance. He thought about all the photos he'd taken, the stories he'd captured through his lens. They weren't just images. They were proof that beauty existed even in places where people tried to ignore it. Giving up now would mean letting fear win. And he couldn't do that, not anymore. Outside, the bystanders' video had gone viral. Social media erupted with outrage, hashtags trending across platforms. Justice for Marcus dominated timelines, accompanied by stories of racial profiling and calls for accountability. Commenters shared their own experiences, turning Marcus's ordeal into a rallying cry for change. The pressure mounted, both online and offline. Protesters gathered outside the station, their chants reverberating through the walls. "No justice, no peace," they shouted, holding signs that read, "End racial profiling" and "Black Lives Matter." Inside, officers exchanged uneasy glances, the growing tension impossible to ignore. For some, it was the first time they truly considered the impact of their actions. One young officer hesitated, recalling a recent training session on implicit bias. Maybe, just maybe, they'd gotten it wrong. At home, Marcus's family debated their next move. "Steve can fix this," his aunt insisted, pacing the living room. "One statement from him, and they'll have no choice but to listen." But Marcus shook his head. "It's not about me," he said quietly. "This happens to people every day, people who don't have famous relatives. If we use his name, it'll take attention away from the real issue." Alone in his cell once more, Marcus reflected on the stereotypes imposed on him versus who he truly was. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't a criminal. He was a photographer, a storyteller, a dreamer. This realization strengthened his resolve. He wouldn't let anyone define him, not the officers, not society, not even his own doubts. As news coverage intensified, officers began reevaluating their roles in perpetuating racial profiling. Some resisted, clinging to old habits, while others admitted, however reluctantly, that change was necessary. For Lawson, it marked the beginning of an uncomfortable but crucial journey toward understanding. Inspired by the support flooding in online, Marcus started seeing his story as part of something bigger. It wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who'd ever been judged for the color of their skin or the dreams they dared to chase. This realization empowered him, filling him with a quiet strength. Whatever came next, he would face it head on. The air in the police chief's office was heavy, almost suffocating. Marcus sat across from the chief, his lawyer beside him, as the department tried to downplay the arrest as a simple misunderstanding. The tension crackled like static electricity, pressing down on everyone in the room. Marcus clenched his fists under the table, his heart pounding. He could feel the weight of systemic injustice bearing down on him, but he refused to let it crush him. "Look," the police chief began, leaning back in his chair with an air of forced calm. "We understand there may have been some miscommunication, but we're willing to move past this if you are." Marcus's jaw tightened. He stared at the man across the desk, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "This wasn't a misunderstanding," he said firmly. "It wasn't just about me being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was about how I look, how people see me before they even know who I am." The chief shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the lawyer before meeting Marcus's gaze again. "Son, mistakes happen. Nobody's perfect. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." "It is big," Marcus shot back, his voice rising slightly, "because it happens every day. To me, to my friends, to people who don't have cameras or lawyers or famous relatives to speak up for them. You can't just call it a mistake and sweep it under the rug. That doesn't fix anything. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself. When he spoke again, his tone softened but carried a quiet intensity that demanded attention. Do you know what it feels like to be treated like you don't belong? To be handcuffed in front of strangers because someone decided your existence is suspicious? It made me feel small, invisible, like I didn't matter. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. But it's not just about me. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, and it won't be the last unless things change. People like me, we're tired of being seen as threats instead of human beings. Reaching into his bag, Marcus pulled out a stack of photographs he'd taken before the arrest. He slid them across the desk toward the chief. Each image captured moments of everyday life. Children laughing on the beach, couples holding hands, waves crashing against the shore. They were simple, ordinary snapshots, but they radiated warmth and humanity. This is why I carry a camera, Marcus explained, his voice filled with passion. Photography lets me tell stories that get overlooked. Stories of joy, resilience, connection. Stories that remind people we're more than the labels they put on us. And when I was arrested, it felt like all of that was taken away from me. Like my dreams didn't matter because of the color of my skin. The chief picked up one of the photos, studying it closely. His expression shifted subtly, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the weight of what had happened, not just to Marcus, but to countless others like him. I hadn't thought about it that way, he admitted quietly. Outside the station, news broke that Steve Harvey had released a heartfelt statement supporting Marcus. What happened to my nephew shouldn't happen to anyone, the message read. It's time we stop making excuses and start addressing the root causes of racial profiling. Apologies aren't enough. We need action. The media quickly picked up the story, amplifying Steve's call for accountability. News outlets ran segments highlighting Marcus's ordeal, framing it as a turning point in the broader fight for justice. Social media buzzed with reactions as people shared their own experiences of bias and discrimination. Hashtags like End Racial Profiling and Stand With Marcus trended nationwide, creating a ripple effect of empathy and outrage. As Marcus scrolled through the comments online later, he felt a surge of emotion. Gratitude, anger, hope, all swirling together. Strangers from all walks of life were speaking out, sharing their pain and demanding change. Their voices joined his, forming a chorus too loud to ignore. Local authorities found themselves under immense pressure to address the systemic issues exposed by the case. For Marcus, seeing the outpouring of support was overwhelming in the best possible way. He realized his voice mattered, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by prejudice. They're listening, he murmured to his parents one evening, staring at his phone screen. Finally, they're listening. Reflecting on his journey, Marcus thought about how photography had always been his way of challenging stereotypes. Through his lens, he captured beauty and authenticity, proving that talent and passion could transcend societal barriers. His art wasn't just a hobby. It was a form of resistance, a declaration that he wouldn't let anyone define him. Back at the station, the confrontation left a lasting impression on the officers. Some resisted the idea of change, clinging to old habits, while others began grappling with their roles in perpetuating systemic racism. Officer Lawson, in particular, found himself unable to shake the memory of Marcus's words. He started attending diversity training sessions, determined to do better, even if it meant confronting uncomfortable truths about himself. After the meeting with the chief, Marcus stepped outside into the sunlight. The warmth on his skin felt like a balm, soothing the raw edges of his emotions. Exhaustion weighed heavily on him, but so did triumph. He knew the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but for the first time in days, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. "I'm not done yet," he whispered to himself, squinting at the horizon. Not even close. Marcus sat at his desk, staring at the blank canvas of his laptop screen. The arrest had left scars, emotional ones that still ached when he let himself think too much about it. But instead of letting bitterness take root, he decided to channel everything he'd been through into something meaningful. He opened a new document and typed out a title, Voices Unseen. It would be more than just a photojournalism project. It would be his way of giving voice to those who were often ignored. Over the next few weeks, Marcus poured his energy into capturing stories of resilience within marginalized communities. He visited neighborhoods where people had faced discrimination for generations but continued to find ways to thrive. He photographed a grandmother teaching her grandchildren how to bake traditional recipes, a young activist leading a community cleanup effort, and a group of teens organizing a free tutoring program. Each image told a story of courage and humanity, showing the beauty in everyday acts of resistance against systemic racism. As word spread about his work, invitations began pouring in. Schools asked him to speak to students about overcoming prejudice. Community centers invited him to lead workshops on using art as a tool for change. At one conference, an organizer introduced him with these words, "Marcus Johnson isn't just a photographer. He's a storyteller, an advocate, and a beacon of hope for all of us." When it was his turn to speak, Marcus stood nervously behind the podium, gripping its edges tightly. The room was packed, filled with people eager to hear his story. He took a deep breath and began. "I used to think my camera made me stand out in a bad way," he admitted, his voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his chest. "But now I realize it's not about standing out. It's about shining a light on what matters." He shared his journey, from the humiliation of being arrested simply for existing to the empowerment he felt when he realized his art could make a difference. "We can't wait for someone else to fix things," he said, his tone firm yet hopeful. "Change starts with us, with our voices, our actions, our willingness to challenge the status quo. And if we do that together, there's nothing we can't overcome." Meanwhile, Officer Greg Lawson sat in a mandatory bias training session, arms crossed and jaw clenched. He didn't want to be there, didn't see why he needed this lecture after years of service. But as the facilitator talked about implicit biases and their impact, something clicked. Lawson thought back to Marcus, the look in his eyes when he was handcuffed, the quiet strength he showed during their meeting at the station. For the first time, Lawson allowed himself to truly consider how his actions might have contributed to the harm caused by systemic racism. After the session, he approached the facilitator hesitantly. "Can I ask you something?" he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "How do you start making things right when you've been part of the problem without even realizing it?" The facilitator smiled gently. "Awareness is the first step," she replied. "Then comes action. Start small. Listen more. Question your assumptions. Advocate for change within your department. It won't happen overnight, but every little bit helps." Inspired by Marcus's courage and the public outcry following the incident, some officers began pushing for reforms within the police department. They formed a committee to discuss accountability measures and anti-racism training initiatives. Though progress was slow and met with resistance, the seeds of change had been planted. Even Officer Lawson found himself joining the conversations, determined to do better, even if it meant confronting uncomfortable truths about himself. Back in the coastal town where it all began, supporters gathered to celebrate Marcus's achievements, holding signs that read, "Justice through art" and "Equality for all." They cheered as he walked among them. Strangers hugged him, thanking him for inspiring them to take a stand. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like he belonged. Not because he blended in, but because he dared to stand out. He returned to the boardwalk where he'd been arrested, now surrounded by friends, family, and supporters. The place that once symbolized fear and injustice had transformed into a space of triumph and unity. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Marcus raised his camera. This time, taking the photograph felt different. It wasn't just about capturing beauty. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his purpose, and his unwavering commitment to justice. Later that evening, as he reviewed the day's photos, Marcus paused on the sunset shot. The colors were vibrant, alive, full of promise. He clicked save, then leaned back in his chair, reflecting on how far he'd come. His journey hadn't been easy, but it had taught him something invaluable. Individual acts of courage could spark meaningful change. And yet he knew the fight wasn't over. Systemic racism wouldn't disappear overnight. It would take vigilance, persistence, and collective action to create a more equitable world. But Marcus also knew that every step forward mattered. Every voice raised, every stereotype challenged, every moment of resilience brought them closer to a future where everyone could live free from prejudice. As he closed his laptop for the night, Marcus whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning."